Hi, I'm Sherri Brooks Vinton, author of Put 'em Up, and today we're going to learn how to can using the boiling water method. The boiling water method is the basic canning method that you use for anything that's acidic, your jams, jellies, salsas, tomato preparations with a little extra lemon juice. Today we're going to be canning some delicious spiced apple chutney, but this could be anything in the pot. This could be a relish or a pickle, and we would use the same method. And here's how it goes. For the boiling water method, you need a big pot of boiling water. Now I have a canner here, and that's great. If you have a canner, you can use that. But if you don't, you could use a pasta pot, lobster pot, any sort of big vessel that will hold boiling water. Doesn't need even to be a very high quality, just a nice pot that will hold some hot water. In this pot, I have a canning rack, and if you have a canning rack, terrific. If you don't, you can use a cake cooling rack or even some of the rings that come with your canning jars and just put them in a layer on the bottom of your canner. The point of all of those things is just to raise the jars off of the bottom of the canner a little bit so that you get good water circulation all around. So you have your canner, you have your canning rack, and then you have your canning jars. Now let's take one of these out of here and look at it. These canning jars are special, and you need to make sure that you're using canning jars for the boiling water method and not reusing old spaghetti sauce jars or mayonnaise jars that just won't get the job done. You use these jars because the glass is a little bit extra thick, and that's going to be important when we're pulling these jars in and out of boiling water. But more importantly, they have a two-piece lid, and you can see that here. The lid has this rubberized gasket on the bottom, and this gasket is going to help form the seal on the top of the jar that will keep our food safe in storage. And because we have a two-piece lid here, gases are going to vent out of the recipe during processing, and that's what's going to give us our vacuum seal. So get yourself some canning jars, separate the pieces into a heat-proof bowl, so you have your lids here and your rings in a pile beside it, and then put all your jars straight down into your canner. And then you want to cover your jars with water by about 2 inches. Again, you want to have that good water circulation all around the jars. So water by 2 inches, and then you want to put your lid on top of the canner and crank the heat up to get a nice simmer going. You're not trying to sterilize the jars at this point. You're just trying to get them nice and hot so that when you pour your hot recipe into them, you won't shock the glass and risk a little crack. So we've got our jars heating up. We have our recipe done, and we have all of our equipment laid out on a nice tea towel, and I've just washed all of my equipment with hot water and soap. You don't have to use anything aggressive or abrasive. You don't have to swab everything down with alcohol and go into your kitchen, in full surgical gear. You just want to have some nice common sense cleanliness in the kitchen. When you have everything laid out, your recipe done, and your jars are hot, you're ready to start filling them. And here's how it goes. Just take your jars out of your canner. You want to use some jar lifters or canning tongs. Pull out one of your canning jars. Now the first jar of very hot water, you want to tip over top of those lids, and you want to do that not to sterilize the lids, but you want to make sure that you're starting to soften up that little rubberized gasket around the top. That's going to promote a good seal. So just line up your jars, as many as your recipe calls for. I'm going to do one as an example here, and then we're going to fill it with this canning funnel. Now if you don't have a canning funnel, that's all right. Just use a regular funnel and saw the bottom off so you get that V shape. If you don't want to go through that, then just use a smaller ladle. It's really just trying to help you be neat about your work. Ladle the recipe into the jar, and as I'm ladling, I'm trying to pay attention to what's called the headspace, and that is the distance from the top of the recipe to the top of the jar. You want to make sure that you have a little bit of space there that's going to allow for expansion. Each recipe is different. Each recipe is going to have a different amount of headspace indicated, so make sure that you're following the rules there. It's important also to have a nice little cap of liquid on top of your recipe when you're canning. So you just want to make sure that you're getting some of the juice from your recipe in that jar and pouring that over top. That's going to keep all of your ingredients submerged under some liquid and keep them fresh during storage. Now I'm going to remove any air bubbles that might be trapped in my jar, and here's how I do it. If you get a canning kit, it's going to come with what's called the bubble tool. The bubble tool looks very similar to a plastic knife. So you could use a plastic knife if that's what you had on hand. I'm using a little skewer. You could use a chopstick. Just make sure that you're not using something metallic that might scratch the glass. So you take that and kind of poke it around between your recipe and the glass to remove any trapped air. And you're doing that again to make sure that you have the right headspace. Take a nice clean tea towel or paper towel, dip it down in that hot water, and just clean off the rim of the glass here so that you're ready to make a nice clean seal up here. You don't want to have any little mustard seed trapped in there, any of the goopy chutney caught in there. So get that nice and clean. And then if you have a canning kit, it's going to come with one of these. This is called the magnet tool. It's handy to have because look what it does. Ooh, fancy. So if you have the canning kit, that's great. But if you don't, then you can just use a pair of tongs, preferably the ones that have the little scalloped edge, or you can just pluck one out with your fingers. Just be quick about it. It's hot water. You just don't want to scratch this white surface here because that might rust during storage and that could be problematic. So be careful of that white surface and just put your lid right down on top of your jar. Do that for all of your jars, and then you want to put the rings on. And you want to put the ring on, and this is really important, just fingertip tight. That's all you need. Just turn that around the top of the jar, and pretty much when the jar starts to spin on its own, you know you're there. After that's done, use your jar lifters, your canning tongs, to lift your jar straight up and down into your canner full of water. You want to make sure that your jars are covered by 2 inches of water. If they're not, go to the sink and get yourself a little extra. Make sure that you have 2 inches of water over your jars because that's going to give you good water circulation all around, and that's important for the process. So after you have 2 inches of water on top, put your lid on, crank the heat up, and get that to a good rolling boil, not a simmer, like a really ferocious boil, almost to the point where the water's spitting out the top of the canner. Once you have that good rolling boil, then you start your timing. That's the processing time. That's the amount of time that your jars are submerged in boiling water. And it's very important not to cheat on that in any way. So check your recipe. They're all going to be different. Give your jars the full processing time indicated. After that time is over, you want to turn the heat off, take the lid off, and let your jars rest for 5 minutes. It's really important to let them rest because if you were to pick them up right away, some of the contents of the jars may seep out. The contents is still boiling and it could come out the top of your jar. So just let them rest. But after that 5 minutes of rest, you want to use your jar lifters, your canning tongs, to pull your jars straight up. Now you'll see there is a little lake of water on top of your jar there. Be sure not to tip that lake off. It's so tempting to want to get that water off the top of your jar. Don't do it. Just put it straight down on a towel-covered surface and don't tip any the water off the top, which could also tip some of the contents out of your jar. That jar is not sealed yet, so it's not tightly sealed to the top of that jar and it could leak. So put it straight down on top of a towel-covered surface, let it sit for 24 hours. After 24 hours, you want to check your seal, and here's how you do that. Take the rim off of your jar, and you want to gently push up on the lid. You should have a good tight fit between the lid and the jar. You can even turn your jar upside down and give it a little shake. If you have that nice tight seal, then you know your seal is formed and this is safe for storage. So you want to just wipe off the top of the lid a little bit. There still might be a little moisture trapped around the top, so dry that off. And then I like to store them like this. I don't put the band back on because humidity in the air could still build up moisture between the lid and the ring, and that could lead to rust, which would compromise your seal. So leave the ring off and just store this jar in a cool, dark place for up to a year. It's the boiling water method. It's one way to put them up.